When children have internet access at home, don't be surprised when they're more confident, creative, and enthusiastic in the classroom. If your child qualifies for free school lunches, you could qualify for discounted Cox high-speed internet for only $9.95 a month. Visit connecttocompete.org/Cox or call 855-222-3252 to learn more. Cox Connect to Compete. Smart tools for school.
Good evening, everyone. Let's get started here with reminding ourselves that in the city government we have 4 goals. We think about these goals every day, every hour of every day. Sound governance, safe and secure city, economic development, and a vibrant neighborhood. And they work together, in fact, cannot work independently at all. Now, a good strategy demands assessment, so we know what we're working on. The question is, how have we done? Well, let's take a look. So this is a very, very exciting map. You'll see Lakewood with a star, and each one of those dots represents a significant population of millennials. And you will notice on this map that Lakewood has more millennials than any other segment or region of the region. We see that population emerging downtown over the last decade. We see a significant piece over in University Heights. There's a little population burst over in Mayfield Heights. We think that has to do with Progressive Insurance. But if you were to look at, study this map, you would clearly understand that when we talk about what they call the fifth migration, which population specialist Richie Perperian of Cleveland State has helped us understand as a region, we know that Lakewood is by far the epicenter of sort of the reinvestment of the millennial generation. And we know this generation is actually bigger than the baby boomer generation. And we know that the baby boomer generation changed everything they did through every phase of their lives. They're now at 10,000 people a day at age 65 entering retirement and Medicare. And we know that the pressures that puts on that program. And we can look with confidence and anticipation that this millennial group will have a similar impact. It will be different. Their expectations, their lifestyle, their capabilities are very different. So one of the opportunities for Lakewood is to, 1, count our blessings that we're in this position, and 2, do all we can to understand the implications of it so that we can foster it and continue to benefit from it in the decades to come. And I think we have a lot to work with here. Another key element of our particular position is that you'll see that green is good, light green is even better, and other colors are not as popular. What this is a reflection of is our relative income tax rate. Our income tax rate in Lakewood is 1.5%. And you can see in this graph that our peers are actually some of the more affluent communities in the county, in the region. Look at Westlake, Bay Village on the west side, and you can look at Moreland Hills and Pepper Pike on the east side. And that the darker green, in fact, represents higher income tax rates. The pinks and the oranges are significantly higher still. You look at cities like Parma at 2.5%, Cleveland Heights 2.25%, Shaker Heights 2.25%. Euclid is actually about 3.5%, but they have a school piece as part of their funding strategy, a little different. So what we have is a unique position in the community of this enormously strong population base with a disproportionately lower income tax rate. And I have to tell you, it should be, and it is for the government, a major goal to keep it that way. And there's reasons that a lot of these cities have raised their income tax rates. And we face those pressures too, but disproportionately we've been able to leverage the strengths we have in our community to fare better. And so we want to leverage that as best as we can. So that's a major opportunity and a challenge for us. This is a very exciting graph. Blue is good in this graph. Dark blue is even better, and non-blue is not as good. This reflects actually property valuation appreciation over the last 3 years. And you can see that actually only 4 cities have a better recovery of their residential real estate, and that's Bay Village, Rocky River, and Orange. Those are the only 3 that fared better. All the other cities in the county were less than us, and most, in fact, went down for the 3rd time. Now, in 2010, Lakewood went down about 10%. It was a hard point for the entire country, as you know. And then in roughly 2012, we went down again about another 4.5%. The good news is we've recovered half that in the last appraisal. And that's it's a profound indicator of the fact that folks want to come here, they want to invest here, and that they're willing to pay to be here. And that is not necessarily representative of many of the cities in this county. So that is a great opportunity and strength that we have, one that we can continue to leverage. And a side benefit of this, of course, to the government is that it will pay us about $1 million more in property tax in the next 3 years, 2016, 17, and 18, than in the previous 3 years. So the downside for a homeowner is that you're going to pay more property tax. The good news is your house is worth more and it's regaining value. And for most folks, that is it's a mixed blessing, but nevertheless, better than the other circumstance where your house continues to decline in value. So that is a unique position for Lakewood to enjoy and benefit from. We focused intensely on housing and needed to. We came off the Great Recession, and its impact was an enormously negative on housing across the country, and that was no different here. And it's important that we continue to stay focused on housing. In previous conversations, we've talked about our Housing Forward, where we focused on our most threatened houses. We did it through a survey where we stood in front of each of the 13,000 one and two families, and we assessed the value, and that allowed us to concentrate on the 15% that were most destabilizing. We also know that in Lakewood and probably everywhere else, that the greatest negative impact or positive impact on a particular house are the 4 to the left, the 4 to the right, and the 8 across the street. So anything we can do to address the integrity of a house that might be drawing down that value in a neighborhood is what we have to do as a government. And we are very focused on doing that. And I think the fact that we benefited disproportionately is a reflection that we have to stay on that course. And we're determined to absolutely do that. We also recognize that we have significant opportunities for redevelopment. This is a McKinley school site. Who here went to McKinley besides me? Peggy went to McKinley. McKinley is no more. Working with our partners in the Board of Education, we worked through a fairly complex process of trying to assess and then address how to demolish an old school building and put it into a position for its growth. And it was a great partner. We were able to both cover our costs and gain some back. But the real eye and the prize was, in fact, this $12 million redevelopment, which brings 40 more households to our community and adds this $12 million property valuation to us and creates a lifestyle choice that we need more of here. The notion of lock and leave is an increasingly popular emotion or a trend among both retirees and empty nesters as well as millennials. So we are in a position to add 40 more of these types of lifestyle choices to us in conjunction with our school board partners here. And if you go by that site today, you will see that they're starting to go vertical. In the back corner, there's 2x4s, and I think they're on second or third floors. And the good news is, of those 40, about 20 of them are sold before they're even built. And that's all deals with the risk of development, of who will buy and who will come. And the good news is we're able to show that risk is there. Down the street from City Hall, the old Fairchild Chevrolet dealership site, which has been a challenging site. Timing was very difficult when the prospects of that development started in 2005, and the Great Recession hit in 2008, and nobody was financing housing developments. But we stayed with it, and we're very excited about the fact that ground is broken today. You'll see lots of excavation down there. And this is a 50-unit site. Price points are in the $250,000 range. Also townhouses, also lock and leave lifestyle. And there's also a significant amount of interest generated already in this particular area. And the great news about this particular development, we're able to develop on the east side, as this case is evidence, and we're also able to develop on the west side. All our neighborhoods are important to us, and creating vibrancy across the whole city is always a major expectation and goal, and this affirms that we're able to do that. So the Gold Coast is the most densely populated neighborhood in the most densely populated city in Ohio and in generally the Midwest outside of Chicago. It's about 50 years old. It's also a lock and leave lifestyle, and it offers an abundance of one-floor living options. But it is high-rise, and it is 50 years old. So we have to continue to work with the owners of these buildings, many of whom are out-of-state owners, to have them be aware of the significant importance of this community to our community, and also how, in fact, I think their timing for reinvestment couldn't be better. In fact, developers have said, if you were to duplicate this investment today, there is not enough money that any developer would have because of the magnitude of the density that's there. So it is a gem, but it needs to be polished up and reinvested in. And we have to remind ourselves as a community about the attractiveness this has for one-floor living options and for a lock-and-leave lifestyle. So it's a gold mine on a Gold Coast, but needs attention and work. We think all the time about businesses and entrepreneurial spirit in Lakewood. Here is a picture of Mike Balsito, who's in the center here. Mike is our entrepreneur in residence. He's a serial entrepreneur, started several businesses, and he leads the conversation locally here about folks who have good ideas and opportunities to become entrepreneurs. We estimate there's several thousand home-based businesses in Lakewood. We really don't know for sure. It's very likely we could have several thousand more, and should. In fact, it also pioneers the concept of live here, work anywhere through digital telecommunication. And that is a great strength for our community, particularly with this millennial group who understands how to do that, and with looming labor shortages in a variety of areas where lifestyle choices will trump necessarily relocation, but digital connectivity allows folks to live anywhere and work anywhere as well. So we have a great opportunity to continue to leverage this, and we must continue to work on this path. We've had good success with it. Well, you know that Madison Avenue was resurfaced last year, and we also know it desperately needed to be. But our experience on Detroit, as we've talked in the past, where a $12 million investment on Detroit actually spawned a $60 million private investment on Detroit. Our expectation on Madison is probably a little more modest. It's a little different, maybe has a little less density to the structures. But nevertheless, our roughly $4 or $5 million investment, including investments in Madison Park and on Madison Avenue, are going to bear fruit, and they already are. So we have worked to foster that kind of entrepreneurial investment. And we are very fortunate that folks, particularly of this younger generation, are not afraid of these older storefronts and recognize that they can run a business at a small access cost because they're not very expensive to rent, and that they can begin to show their way with their products. And that's a great strength of ours, and we're going to continue to leverage Madison, an expectation in return. Well, citywide fiber optic network is part of our investment, working with our school board, again, knowing that pioneering in the advancement of internet connectivity and content for education and for government as well is really critical to our success in terms of speed and integrity. And recognizing that the world is changing dramatically in terms of how we historically have gotten public networks, which is through cable providers. And the deals of the old franchise days were that we would be offered these services for free in return for a pseudo-monopoly of a cable operator. Well, those days are gone, and cable operators themselves are very stressed to think about how they're going to deliver content in an era of live streaming of content, where they have competition where they didn't have it before. And as important as this is for us, we needed to secure its future. And there are many residual advantages in addition to securing the government's capacity and the city school board's capacity to do their work. And that is bringing in basically blinding fast speed to our commercial corridors. So what we're going to benefit from here, in fact, you see these cables being installed throughout the community this past winter. Of course, nobody expected them to be able to do it this winter because of the weather, but the weather, of course, was very, very complimentary to any kind of construction trade. So we're a little ahead of schedule. That's good news. And when the schools are ready, it's going to be available for them. And we'll be working at speeds that are about 100 times faster than what we're accustomed to today. And that's a real critical advantage we have in terms of how we anticipate our needs to do business. We call this part of the big gig investment. And one of the benefits to you as citizens in Lakewood is free Wi-Fi in our major parks. So that should be available this summer as part of a spillover effect of this capacity, and we're excited to offer that. We also have, actually, you'll see, let me go back a slide. This is actually a camera that is on a pole by Solstice Steps. There's 2 cameras on Solstice Steps. We actually have over 20 cameras in public spaces today, And with this new fiber optic network, we're going to offer 21 more in public spaces. And the good news is the connectivity of these cameras through hardwired cable are going to be infinitely more reliable and have better visual acuity than our Wi-Fi based cell card cameras that we have today. So one of the objectives of the surveillance is the concept of deterrence. You know, we'd love to have every bad guy in the region say, don't go to Lakewood, you're going to get caught. As it is today, our police force is very successful. They arrest pretty close to 78% of the perpetrators. We'd like that to be 100%, and we'd love them not even to think about coming here. But if they do come here and they do commit a crime, we've got a shot at being able to look back in time and use this as a great investigation tool. So we see these types of installations all over New York City. We saw them in Boston in the marathon bombing. We see them all over the place in London and other cities in Europe, and we're going to leverage that technology and its reliability to help us, in fact, become a safer city. This is a featured piece of equipment that's going in the new Kids Cove in Lakewood Park. It started off as a $400,000 modest investment, and in order to do it right, we recognized we needed to improve our investment. Working with City Council, we're now able to invest $1 million, and there are significant redesigns. This is just one of the many features there. In our parks, usages have changed, and our expectations of safety in a park have changed. You know, parents today want 100% eyes on their children when they play in a playground. And parks designed in a different era didn't necessarily offer that. So we can be safer, we can have more fun, and we can, in fact, build a major attraction in a major park. And we're looking forward to breaking ground on this in the fall of this year after Labor Day. So it'll be ready by next spring with a great new investment in a park. We know that mobility is a great opportunity to advance our health and our fun and our environment. We're exploring a project now to reduce lanes on the Clifton Extension, which is the portion between West Clifton and the Rocky River Bridge that goes through Clifton Park. Currently, there are 4 lanes, 2 lanes in each direction. That actual investment made in the mid-'60s was put in place before I-90 was built. Today, its volumes are different and its needs are different. And with the advent of the expansion of the new Inner Belt Bridge that will open in the fall of this year, we have an opportunity to consider how we can capture those lanes for pedestrian, at least 1 lane in each direction for pedestrian and bike use. And that actually is an indicator of a project that came from the citizens of that community. And we've explored it, we've done traffic studies, we've gotten approval from ODOT, or not quite formal approval yet. We're working with our partners in Rocky River to see if we can expand that across the bridge to create another pedestrian and bike access to and through our community, and perhaps link our communities in ways we've not been able to do before. We're looking forward to putting bike lanes on Madison Avenue. Those will be painted this spring when the weather's firmly here. And we also are working on creating quiet zones. So it's a big, challenging project, actually. We'll talk a little bit about that later. We have 27 rail crossings here. The 3 a.m. train that goes through Lakewood, I'm sure we all hear it. And today we have about 6 trains that go through our community. That's up from about 2.5 trains just 2 years ago. And one of the questions is what we can do today so that years from now, if that volume were to improve or increase, that we can make sure that our communities are less affected by trains blowing their horn 27 times each time they go through. Although keep in mind that in the late 70s, there was about 40 trains a day that went through Lakewood. So 6 is something that bears scrutiny compared to what that experience was. Our sidewalks are important to us. We have 180 miles of them. We're in year 4 of a 10-year strategy to eliminate trip hazards. One of the most cost-effective and easiest ways for us to get moving in our community is to step outside our front door, walk down our front steps, and walk around the block. And we want to be able to do that in wheelchairs. We want to do it with strollers, and we want to do it without tripping. And by taking a systematic approach over 10 years, working with the funding from City Council, we're able to effectively gain some traction there. So at the end of this year, we'll be 40% done. And we started with the most popular pedestrian avenues and are working throughout the city. So the good news is a lot of the commonly used sidewalks have been addressed, but we have plenty more to go. We have to stay with that program. We know there's two major trends when we think about the millennials we addressed earlier and the baby boomers that we talked about earlier as well. Our human services are focused on those two bookends. We work closely with the county on everybody in between, but uniquely here in Lakewood, we've been particularly interested in early childhood, and we've also been interested in supporting our seniors. The emerging trends today that we have a lot to learn about are age in place for our seniors. We know the cost implications are better. We know that their mental health issues are better. But the support requirements are going to emerge to be very challenging. And again, our leading partners will be the county, and we're looking forward to working with them. And we agree that internally, our three primary roles in this realm are to be assessors of our needs so that we can communicate it effectively, to be basically assemblers of folks who can cast interest and collaborate on these issues, and then be advocates for these folks in the community. So we've had these commitments for long decades in Lakewood, and we're looking forward to doing a better job of understanding the implications of our role and how we can represent our citizens to these particularly vulnerable and opportunistic needs, which is early childhood and then senior citizens aging in place. Well, body cameras are coming. It's a national conversation. You know, we've learned a lot in the last 2 years about police engagement in communities other than Lakewood. And we actually long have had a lot of cameras with our police officers. We've had dash cameras for years, and our new police cars have 5 cameras on them. This will be a 6th. We've placed an order with TASER. Our police force did a very thorough evaluation of the best options. And unfortunately, there's a high demand for these cameras, and our hope was that we would have them by April of this year. We are probably lucky if we can get them by June or July, but nevertheless, we're preparing for them, and they have significant implications for us as a community. One, it provides an enormous amount of vigilance. It provides accountability on behavior of both citizens and police. And it also provides a significant amount of challenges of collecting a large amount of data and managing it successfully for defense attorneys and for prosecutors. This is an example of a cloud-based platform where the servers that will store all these this visual data will be actually at servers elsewhere out of Lakewood. The high-speed internet will be an important element of how we can access and upload this. In fact, it's a critical element of our ability to perform these kind of services leveraging higher speeds. So body cameras are coming. Now, this is an example of a strategy that's taken a couple years to pull off. We'll spend about $200,000 this year to get in place. We'll spend about half that each year to manage it. And then in 5 years, we'll probably have to replace this technology. But we know it will help us. And our police officers, and I'm very grateful for this, have a full understanding of the implications of what it means for them. And they're open to the accountability, and they think it will be an enormous advantage for them. And they always like to be able to tell an accurate story, and this will help them to do that. So look for that. We talked about fiber optic cameras. That's an example. You'll see those around. Health and wellness and environmental stewardship. This is a picture of about 22 of our citizens down at our wastewater treatment facility who have dedicated themselves this year to helping us explore stormwater management, EPA Clean Water Act compliance, and work through the thorny issues of what engineering issues make sense for Lakewood, and just as importantly, what's the financial equity of who's going to pay for what. Generally, you think about your sewer rates and water rates that we use to fund these types of investments, and will continue to do that, and that's a national story, by the way. But we also have a significant amount of personal property, private property investments that have to happen. And in a community like ours, that's not necessarily an easy and affordable conversation. But nevertheless, the federal law is strong, it's being enforced vigorously, and we have to continue to make investments. We will continue to do that. We've got a plan that's under permitted activity that gets us through about 2019, and we're in constant negotiations to make sure that we are addressing both the spirit of the law, to the letter of the law, to the best we're able, and show good faith. But in Lakewood, there's not going to be a silver bullet. There's going to be many, many different solutions. And my caution and advice to each of you is if you're going to make investments in, start digging around your house, make sure you're thinking about your stormwater implications as well. Because It's the cheapest time to do it when you're already there digging. My worst fear is that someone waterproofs their basement and 2 or 5 years from now discovers that they should have put in or cleaned out or rearranged their pipes, what they call laterals of water and stormwater sanitary water and stormwater as they leave their house. And that somehow they didn't understand they should have addressed that when they could have and should have much more economically. So part of your assignment is to, when you see your neighbors dig, and say, hey, make sure you're talking to the city about stormwater compliance and Clean Water Act. The branded strategy is Clean Water Lakewood, and we have a lot of work ahead, but we're fortunate to benefit from significant citizen engagement there. Well, we talked a lot through the past several years about the future of healthcare, and this community worked hard to make an important decision. 12 months of deliberations by City Council, over 50 public meetings, and City Council appropriately reviewed and ultimately affirmed the critical assumptions that were advanced by the trustees of the hospital, and they made a decision. So over the next several years in the future, we have some significant support and investments we need to make. We have to make sure we build this community wellness foundation in the spirit that it's intended, which is community-based for community benefit. So we are beginning to assemble a group of steering committee folks who can look at the governance issues, the legal implications, and begin to address some of the foundational questions of how, as a community, we can properly discuss this. I would anticipate in the next month or two that we'll be in a position to start having community conversations about this subject, about what it means to us and what we need to do to make sure it's effective now, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now. We also have the opportunity to begin to think about new development. We know that Cleveland Clinic expects to spend $34 million on a site adjacent to the current hospital site. And we have to begin to think about what the implications are of the existing site. It could remain in some form healthcare. It could remain or be repurposed for other institutional purposes using existing buildings. It could be redeveloped for commercial office space or residential or some combination of all of those. We have the luxury of time right now. The actual first opportunity that a shovel could go in the ground would be roughly June of 2018. So we have 2.5 years to think collectively as a community about what makes sense for what is clearly a once-in-a-century reinvestment. Part of the transaction that was approved by council gives the city government $7 million to use for rehabilitation or demolition as we see fit. And we're able to then, with confidence, think about how we can be an investor in the future of healthcare. The great news is we own this land. And when you talk about development, for those who have been involved in it, if in fact site control is controlled by the beneficiary of the local entity, you have an enormous greater say in what happens there. And so we have an opportunity to speak up as a community and think long and hard about that. So we'll be organizing ourselves. We started last August. We'll be talking about that again and again and again over the next 2.5 years. We had an active living task force of a dedicated group of about 8 citizens. They met over the past 1.5 years, and they've submitted over 100 thoughtful recommendations to us of how we can, in fact, increase the chance and connectivity of each of us as citizens to become more physically active in our community. Some of them cost nothing at all. Some of them are more elaborate, but everything in between, and we have to take a thoughtful approach to the good work they did and begin to implement many steps that will make this community more engaged physically. We're going to be digging, not as much as last year. Last year, the schools launched $100 million worth of first demolition and then construction. And at the same time, we were digging on Madison. I think those of us who watched that job know the contractor did an outstanding job of moving through that project with the least amount of disruption given its complications. But here you see blue lines are new water mains, brown lines are new resurfacing. We have some signals on Franklin that are going to be going in and new signals on Madison they've been working on, although that contractor has a big case of the slows. But we're going to finish that job this year. Should have finished it last year. And then Franklin will begin to get new signals as well. And those signals are designed to reduce congestion. A lot of the funding that goes for these signals is Clean Air Act money, federal money. When a car sits at a red light idling, it's producing foul air, and if there's no reason for that car to be sitting there because of no cross traffic, we have an opportunity to change that equation. So these signals are all designed to improve how we manage and thoughtfully shift the traffic signalization so we can keep traffic moving effectively through our community, lowering the impact of clean air or negative air. Hilliard Square Theater is a major threat to public safety. It's coming down this year. Thanks to the county, we have $200,000 towards probably a $900,000 demolition. But nevertheless, this building has to come down. Hurricane Sandy practically killed it, so it's a dead theater standing, I suppose, at this point, and now we've got to take the rest of it down. It's a thorny demolition. There's a ton of asbestos in the plaster and elsewhere in the theater. In its day, it was a wonderful, wonderful addition to our community. It became orphaned when the apartments to the west of it were built and wiped out its parking capacity. But nevertheless, this theater is seen its best days, and it needs to come down. So you'll see that later on in this summer. We look forward to working with our Board of Education members as they are thoughtful about redeployment of their remaining schools that will be decommissioned. Taft is one. Franklin is going to go into alternative use, and they're beginning their thoughtful reflection. We look forward to working with them to support that, whatever it is and wherever it is and whenever it is, and it can go in a variety of directions. But I would also submit to city government and to the community and to the board that we have an opportunity to think long and hard about City Hall, its activities, its location, built in 1958. We have a Board of Education in an about 100-year-old building that they own but requires an enormous amount of maintenance. And how might we work together as we redevelop a downtown to maybe foster greater engagement of our two great legislative groups, our school board and the city council in particular, and make our government more accessible, maybe lower cost of that government, and leverage each other's resources to our mutual advantage and to the advantage of our taxpayers. Whether that goes and how that might happen, no one knows, and we're not really bound or obligated to think of any orthodoxy there other than we have an opportunity. And I think we're all open to thinking long and hard about what that might be, and this is the time to do it. City Hall continues to work hard on doing its work more effectively. We are very challenged by mental health and addiction training for our public safety. We have several training sessions scheduled throughout the year, and that includes all customer-facing folks. And I would say in the nation, and Lakewood is no exception here, mental health challenges are real, they're significant, and happily I think they're emerging on both federal and state and other legislative concerns as well. There's not historically much money invested here, but it is an enormous need, and we look forward to advancing our performance there. Citizen phone call management and customer service, console auditorium technology. Safe folks know you have sometimes a hard time hearing. It's old technology. It was actually installed in the 80s, and we look forward to improving that. City charter was developed to update its performance. We can look forward to conversations of that in the fall. Union agreements on the city side are expiring at the end of this calendar year, 2016, and we look forward to the discussions with our 7 bargaining units. And that includes, of course, a full review of how health insurance can be offered in this town in the changing landscape of healthcare. So Lean Lakewood, which is our internal continuous improvement effort, is a big part of our work culture, and we're working hard to make it even a bigger part. Over 100 cities have become trained as the entry-level skill level of yellow belts, and we have 8 intermediate skilled trainees of green belts. And if you remember from previous conversations, this is a manufacturing developed strategy, primarily developed on the floors of Toyota. The Japanese concept Kaizen means many small changes for the better, and it employs a strategy of direct observation, operator experience, and common sense to examine how we conduct our business. And we look for opportunities to streamline, take out steps, and improve things that will gain us speed of performance, that will give us improved quality of outcome, and maybe even lower cost. Any one of those is an important outcome. Any 2 of them is really effective. And sometimes you hit the trifecta of all 3, and we have improved our government. And we are obligated on your behalf as taxpayers to do everything we can to, in fact, do it. I want to share sort of a big idea. And actually, we have a former Speaker of the House with us who can understand this even better than the most of us. But the 2011 state budget clobbered Ohio's cities, didn't it, Armin? And Armin fought vigorously against the impact that. It came in the form of several major moves by the Ohio General Assembly and the governor. And that was cut in half local government funds that historically had been honored since the 30s between governors and cities in Ohio. Lakewood got over $3 million worth of local government funds. Today we're at half that number. It also eliminated the estate tax, which we could argue the merits of that, but for most cities, Shaker Heights is a great example, they were able to get an enormous amount of estate tax. And as a consequence of losing it, they had to raise their income tax by 0.5% to what is now 2.25%. But the remaining portion of the local government fund is under challenge. There is a philosophic view in Ohio that local governments at the municipal level can fend for themselves, and if you need more money, you should just go to your taxpayers and make the case, and they'll either give it to you or they won't. But at the state of Ohio, there's a belief by many, our governor included, and many in the Ohio General Assembly, that a 0% income tax at state level is a desirable state. And they're willing to drive down, in fact, their costs at the expense of revenues we have long gotten from the state to achieve their goal, leaving the cities in Ohio in perilous condition. Now, we talked about those maps earlier. Lakewood is in a disproportionately better position than most cities in the state of Ohio. And we've talked about why that is the case. Some of it's just our unique location, our design, the millennial impact. Those are all important factors here. But nevertheless, cities in Ohio are under pressure. And you'd be interested, Armin, to know that finally, mayors across the state are banding together in a variety of coalitions to do a better job of articulating the importance of state collaboration on the urban Ohio. And that's coming in 4 major coalitions. The transportation side is NOACA. It's a 5-county regional governance structure. It's an emerging 30 big city coalition led by the mayor of Dayton, Nan Whaley. First suburbs, of which Lakewood is one, inner ring suburbs across the region here in Cuyahoga County, as well as Dayton in particular, to a lesser degree in Columbus, and then to sort of a disorganized basis in Cincinnati. But that group is talking about the age of their infrastructure, their dwindling tax base, increased poverty levels, and as Mayor Lyken of Shaker Heights effectively argues, inner ring suburbs are the connective tissue of a metropolitan region. And as they go, that region reflects its impact. You know, and even if you're on the outer ring, you have to drive through the inner ring to get to the inner city. And if you're in the inner city, the same is true. So the vitality of the inner ring is critical to urban America. And by the way, this is a national conversation as well. And then the last coalition is that mayors and managers across the state have long been organized. But it's been a loose coalition and not necessarily set up for advocacy. Well, the unique thing about Lakewood is that we are in all 4 of these coalitions. And we are in a unique position not only to use our strength, but our understanding and our voice in all 4 of these, and we need to do that. The mayor of Lakewood has a standing seat on the NOACA board. The first suburbs was started by a group of mayors, of which Madeline Kame was one of the pioneers back in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was a good idea then. It's a better idea now. I'm currently the chairman of First Suburbs in Cuyahoga County. Mayors and Managers is a loosely formed coalition that it's beginning to galvanize itself. The nice thing about that group is it's really a bipartisan group. Disproportionately, the inner city and the inner ring are sort of Democratic mayors, and the outer ring are Republican. And if you're going to make headway in a Republican-dominated Ohio General Assembly and a governorship, you need to have Republicans helping you to make those cases. The mayors and managers bring that conversation to us equally. The big city coalition, the top 30 cities, we are in the middle of that pack. And why 30? Well, because at 30 you have actually 15 Democratic mayors and 15 Republican mayors. And that's an important piece of the coalition too. The good news is you're seeing, I think I just hit something, you're seeing a significant movement, and we have a great opportunity to coordinate that. Our own former Lakewood resident, Ned Hill, now a full professor at Ohio State, is helping us. We're having a very important coalition meeting of all 4 of these groups on May 2nd down in Columbus. He's leading the analytical part of that. And we look forward to making headway. Our goal is to position a vigorous conversation for the 2017 state budget. One, to play defense, keep the local government funds that we have, and secondly, reinstate some support that was taken away from us in 2011. And whether it's called local government, which is probably a bad concept, or let's rebuild Ohio in the metropolitan area, which is probably more of a winning concept, is where we need to go. So here in Lakewood, we need to continue to educate ourselves about the sustainable city strategy, which is a fix-it-first, anti-sprawl conversation developed over a period of 2 or 3 years, and we have a major role in it. Some ideas take patience and perseverance. We talked about LEDs in our streetlights last year. Well, the fact of the matter is there are significant regulatory blockages to that. Public Utilities Commission, First Energy strategies are going to make that thorny. We know that there's technology today that would cut our energy use in half and our cost in half. We spend $600,000 a year on streetlights. They're very important to our public safety, but technology would be our friend if we can get to it. So that's an example of an idea we're going to be working on for years to come. We talked about quiet zones earlier. Well, the rail lobby in the United States is very strong. They've been at it for about 200 years. And they accept their liability challenges, but they take their defense very seriously. And blowing a horn through a community is their most effective way to keep somebody from being surprised that there's a train running through it. So we do have opportunities to improve there, but it's going to be a challenge. Other ideas we've talked about tonight take years to develop. Sometimes a minimum of 3, sometimes 5. The Solstice Steps was 3 years in the making. The fiber optic was really almost 3 years in the making. The clean water work is going to be decades in the making. Kids Cove, we actually started 3 years ago. And we actually have a lot of control over these projects. So my message to you is the things we talk about today in our community will bear fruit likely 3 or 4 years from now. And one of our challenges as a culture is to be patient and not give up on it. And I'd like to close by thanking the Chamber of Commerce for a wonderful video presentation of our city. And then we'll go to questions. Well, it's a great time to be in Lakewood. And I think the byword is we have to remain focused, optimistic, and we approach 2016 with an enormous amount of strength. And that's a very, very fortunate position for a city to be in Ohio. And we stand really in a unique position there. So we'll work together to make it even better. So what I'd like to do is open the floor to questions and see if there's anything that pops out in your minds here that we can address. Yes? I'm sorry, say again?
What will happen to the nurses and patients?
The hospital is closed as we speak. There were 845 employees in January in the hospital. The Cleveland Clinic worked with each of them to find comparable employment elsewhere in the Cleveland system. And my understanding is about 6 retired, about 10 chose to leave the system and work elsewhere. So as a practical matter, it was almost employment transition. And actually the Cleveland Clinic had never done that before. And most hospitals, by the way, when they're in a circumstance like that, don't do that. And it was an important value for the community. I think City Council made it clear early on that that was a major concern. Many members of the community did as well. And we were able to put appropriate pressure. But I think Clinic understood that it was an important move on their part. They have needs for good people. There were many, they were all great employees at Lakewood Hospital. And they were able to find jobs. About 160 of those lived in Lakewood. And those folks are working in the clinic environment. Ruth Ann?
Thank you. First of all, I just want to really thank your administration and City Council for all the work that you've done. And I think, clearly Lakewood is a great place to live. And largely because of the stewardship of the public employees. But my question is, the state legislature and the governor has also sort of pushed education funding, taken it out of the state budget and pushed it back on local school districts to the point where school districts now have to seek levy increases to cover their costs. And I'm wondering if you think it would make sense to include school districts in your public sector coalitions for urban areas, because they're experiencing the same issues, and obviously the school districts are critically important to the vitality of a community.
That's a great suggestion. Great suggestion. In Lakewood, we have a long-standing working relationship with our school board here. That isn't the case in a lot of cities. So when a lot of mayors and city councils approach their advocacy, they don't necessarily look at the school board as their allies. But here we do it every day. But I think I'll take that challenge. And Superintendent Patterson, why don't you and I talk about how we can work together on that? So thank you, Ruth Ann, for that suggestion. Good idea. Yeah. Anyone else? Tell you what, Tamara, and then Ben, right? And then you and Nabalan.
Tara Peppard. Mayor Summers, I moved to the city. I was very happy at the time that it had a hospital that was 104 years viable. In light of the decanting plan and in light of the tortious interference of the agreement with the clinic, I am wondering why there wasn't more effort, why there was not an open public bid to save our hospital. There are so many elderly in our city, and there are so many disadvantaged that use that hospital. I have great concerns. And the second concern, in addition to the people that are affected, the people that could walk to the hospital, is the loss of over $1 million in income tax revenue that will be replaced with only $30,000, possibly, with the Health and Wellness Center. So in addition to this financial concern, there's also the school board where $6 million over budget. So there's 2 issues that I would like to ask you about, and how, right now we're surviving on a rainy day fund, but how long does that rainy day fund last? Thank you.
Well, there's a lot to your questions. First of all, I'm not going to take on the school board's issues. They work very hard to deal with that, and I know they have strategies that are employed to deal with the construction of the new buildings. And I know they're very thoughtful about that. Well, there's many aspects to your conversation. First of all, one other piece that I should remind you of about employment. Of the 845 employees that were employed in January, 250 are still employed in Lakewood. So that's really a net loss of about 600 jobs. Now, that's an important number in Lakewood. And I will tell you, I think about those 600 all the time. One way I think about them is how do we get and replace those 600? The good news is they come in many forms here. Those 40 residents that are moving in new housing at McKinley are the equivalent of 40 jobs. The 50 at Rockport that are going to be moving here into our community are the equivalent of 50 jobs. Roundstone Insurance is moving from Westlake. They're bringing 47 jobs with plans to add several more into the Christian Science Church at the other end of this block. So that's 50 jobs. The Cleveland Clinic is moving 30 nurse navigator jobs, 20 from Beechwood, 10 they're going to create here. They're setting up shop in the Community Wellness Center, which the city now owns effective this past week. That's 30 jobs. So you get the idea that we're at 600 negative. We can add pretty close to 140 off that, plus 30, so almost 170. So that puts us at about pretty close to maybe 350 more we need to add here. And we're going to go after it and get those jobs. It's not going to be easy. We're going to build them 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 at a time. But those are important to us. Now, the good news is the financial strength of the city. And you have on your seat, on the flip side, is a graph and a chart that sort of details the financial strength of the city. And over the last roughly 8 years, we have gained significant strength. And the deal that was approved by City Council in December will bring $19.6 million in cash to the city. That 19.6, if you were to divide it by roughly the 10 years left on the lease, if you use that analogy, is about $2 million a year, which happens to rival the rent and income tax that we would have gotten had the status quo played out successfully. So we have the good fortune of having a buffer of 10 years worth of additional funding. We also have the opportunity to recreate 5.7 acres. We think that's somewhere between a $20 and $40 million redevelopment. Depends on the nature of the redevelopment. That will add significant financial strength. And the other good news is, remember that millennial graph? Well, disproportionately, the strength of the household income in Lakewood has been grown significantly over the last 2 years. And in fact, last year, our income tax collections were $1.3 million higher in 2015 than they were in 2014. In addition, we talked about the real estate value growth. That will deliver an additional $1 million. So we're in the fortunate position of having a buffer, $19.6 million, plus the institutional economic development that happens here and needs to keep happening, offsets some of those vulnerabilities. The fact of the matter is, in an economy like ours today, in any community across the nation, it is not static. It does not stand still. It ebbs and flows. There are gains and there are losses. And one of the challenges in a community like this is to anticipate where we're going to be vulnerable and try and head that off the best we're able and prepare ourselves for hard times if they're coming, which in our case we're anticipating and building that financial strength to weather it, but more importantly, create positive investments that will offset it. And that's really the challenge of this community in the future. So there are many other aspects to your question. I don't think I got them all, but I'll leave it to the school board at some other time and place. Good question, and I'm grateful that you asked. Pam?
I have a kind of a double-edged. Lakewood Hospital was 1,100 employees in recent years, and that did not include linen, food service, and other ancillary services. Those folks were not Lakewood Hospital employees. So I'd like to understand that this past year there were only 860 employees left. So I want everybody to be aware that the decanting plan took away several hundred before the hospital closed. And I think that when you speak about that we need to realize that there are hundreds of jobs that are not included in that 850. My other question, please explain that. My other question is, if there is nobody wanted Lakewood Hospital, and nobody that was viable would run Lakewood Hospital, why do we have, why are we
Both questions. The 1,100 roughly employees represents the number of W-2s, and many of them are part-time or ebbing and flowing.
1688 was the W-2s.
Well, the
2014.
the key driver and challenge for Lakewood Hospital was its continued diminishing volumes, and that started to show up at about 2007. And one of the key elements of the economics of healthcare in a hospital is heart surgery. It was the golden goose for many decades. And in 2007, Lakewood Hospital performed about 90 open heart surgeries. At that point in time, Fairview was doing about 300 plus. The minimal threshold for competency is usually at about 200 a year. And so decisions were made to consolidate that major element of very profitable intensive intervention to Fairview in 2007. Today, Fairview Hospital has about 180. And the good news is a lot of that is driven by advancing technology where open heart surgery is replaced by stents and other less intrusive interventions for heart care. Good for patients, bad for hospitals. And we see that drama playing out in a variety of areas all over the region in terms of, well, over the country, and world for that matter, in terms of the impact on inpatient care. So the fact of the matter is that Lakewood Hospital has been under adverse pressure for many, many years in terms of its ability to be viable. What was the second question? Oh, right. The covenant, right. Yeah, well, the fact is it's independent physicians could open a specialty hospital today on that site if this community believes that's the highest and best use of that land. It could be sort of independent physician-driven alternatives. It could not be an independent physician general hospital, and it could not be a general hospital run by a system like Metro or UH. And I would say that was a major part of the negotiations. I'm not going to speak for council. Nothing I say tonight speaks on their behalf. They can speak on their behalf, so I will give you my opinion. There was legitimate attempts to try and create those economic options, but in the process of fairly vigorous negotiations, there were gains and losses on both sides, and that was one that was not negotiated out. I would say it's a misnomer to think that Lakewood or the Cleveland Clinic has an exclusive domain over the city of Lakewood. That's not the case. That we're talking about 5.7 acres, a very small percentage of our land mass, and that our expectation is that other investments by other systems very likely would and could and should be welcomed here to provide the variety of healthcare choices. One thing I'd like you to remember is Lakewood Hospital at its highest water mark only had about 47% of the business in Lakewood. This has always been a very competitive local market. For years, probably decades, 20% of our citizens go to Metro, and will likely continue to do so for a variety of reasons. UH has a very strong presence here in terms of client demand. They have a family health center probably less than 4 miles away from where we're sitting at the corner of Columbia 990. They invested $100 million in St. John's West Shore, which changed dramatically the landscape of healthcare choices to the west of us. We have a Lutheran Hospital 5 miles away, a Metro 7 miles away, and Fairview 3.8 miles away. We have a lot of healthcare choices. That's a good position for a community like ours. Most communities don't have that range of options and the proximity. We're also about to invest in a very significant outpatient-driven delivery system. When we talk about some of the folks who are maybe the neediest in terms of care, walking to the hospital, I got to tell you, they didn't walk to admit themselves. They walked to get outpatient services. 94% of the services provided out of Lakewood Hospital before it closed were outpatient driven. Those services are exactly the types of services we're going to be investing in here more vigorously. Folks will still be able to walk down there to get those kind of services that are designed to keep them out of the hospital. And that's a major thrust of the economics of healthcare today. So, next question. Ben.
I'm wondering about what's happened to the traffic flow on Detroit through the business district. During the business times, you can hardly drive through.
Yeah, the Ben's question was about our congested half hour or so, particularly in the 5 or so o'clock and maybe other parts of the day. Well, the good news is we have a much more vibrant downtown. We have a lot of more folks going there. The bad news is they're driving their cars there. And one of the challenges for us is in a community like ours is that we don't have throughways. And we're not designed that way. The fact of the matter is, if you want to make time east, west, and Lakewood, you should probably go to Franklin or Clifton. Detroit is designed to really be sort of a stopping point. Can we improve it through congestion management? We're obligated to do our best. But the fact of the matter is, it's a busy downtown, and that has mixed blessings to us. There was a question of this woman in front first.
Hi, my husband and I are here from Bay Village. We're baby boomers, and we appreciated your presentation. Very impressed with it. My son is a millennial that has bought 3 4-apartment buildings in Lakewood. So he's asking this question. He wants to know if there's a plan for revitalization of the east end of Detroit, where Detroit hits West 117th.
Well, it's a great question. We have many pockets of Lakewood. We work to improve each one of them. There's significant investment going on the east end of Madison as we speak. That will be a spillover effect to the east end as well. That includes an old church that's still in the process of being revamped to a restaurant and a brew pub. We've had several small businesses move into storefronts on the east end of Madison. We talked earlier about the $12 million Rockport redevelopment. That is on the east end. It's actually probably 2 blocks from 117th Street on the north side and south side. That will bring 50 households that will be consumers of amenities in that neighborhood. That's a real important thrust of economic vitality. And our expectation is that will be a catalyst to other spill-off investments. So that's been in the works for about almost 7 years to pull off that one. So to getting a $12 million reinvestment in the east end of Lakewood is really the nearest term advantage we can say for the time being. But I would say we have other storefronts we're working on. There's actually a block of storefronts on the north side of Detroit, just immediately to the east of City Hall, that are fundamentally empty now. So that creates some pressure and opportunities. One of our challenges here in Lakewood is that many of these buildings are owned by absentee owners, oftentimes second-generation family members who moved out of the region. First generation owned and operated these storefronts and lived upstairs. And they pass it on to their kids. Their kids live elsewhere out of state, and their connection to Lakewood is non-existent. And their motivation to do something dramatic that we need is not there. As long as they're getting a rent check, it's all plus to them. And so our challenge is to change that equation, sometimes by putting pressure on them, sometimes by helping them understand, sometimes by introducing them to a buyer that could make it a better deal for all of us. But our economic development department works very vigorously on this kind of granular level to make headway. And slow, but we have a good track record of success there, and we're determined to stay with it. So hopefully that gives your son hope as a landlord. By the way, we have 30,000 housing units in Lakewood. 54% of them are rental. We have about 1,500 1- and 2-family landlords in Lakewood. We need these landlords to be successful. They're a big part of the fabric of our community. We've worked with them to help them understand the laws through Judge Carroll and his very effective presentations through housing court experiences, fair housing. We help them to understand the housing department's view of regulatory compliance. We were helping them to understand the implications of bed bugs. We have a lot of challenges in our community. We need our landlords to be successful. And we're getting very good engagement from about 1,000 of these landlords. There's about 500 that frankly aren't with the program yet, but we're not giving up on that either. So I presume your son's one of the 1,000 that we're working with. We give them discounted tenant screening services, all kinds of things to help them to make better decisions, because we need them to be vital, successful, and investors. Yeah. Kevin?
Thank you, Mayor. I have friends who live around Reno, Nevada, and I can't tell you how overjoyed they were when government officials landed that Tesla deal. You know, they're building Tesla cars in Reno. It's a boom for Reno. I
Well, that's a great question. There's many false statements in it in terms of slipping away, letting it happen. So I don't agree with the spirit of your comment, but I do want to address my role and how I viewed that role. And this is an appropriate forum to do that. I come from a manufacturing experience. I was an owner, an operator of a middle market company that faced many obstacles along its 60-year career. And I grew to understand how adverse trends, downturns, recessions affected the performance and viability of organizations. When I arrived as a mayor, the mayor of Lakewood has a seat on the Board of Trustees, the scenario was as clear as anything that this hospital is in trouble. And the question then is, what are you going to do about it? You could try and kick the can down the road. Would have been easy, comfortable to do that. Or you could bear down and say, why is this hospital in trouble? What makes sense? What would make it viable? And what are the needs of this community? And I was part of an initiative by the trustees to address those questions. And it took us over 2.5 years to get a thoughtful reflection on the seismic changes that are happening in healthcare, both economically, regulatorily, and technologically. And all those are variables that are part of the puzzle here. But the goal always was, how can we make sure there's healthcare in Lakewood? Not necessarily a bid that's successful, but what we wanted was a significant investment in healthcare that made sense, that did two things: met the needs of our citizens and was financially viable long-term. And so we, through the odyssey of really looking back, we've had this conversation with many of you over the last 3 years, and publicly in the last 1.5 years, we've listened to these same questions. And I recognize I've not been on a podium to direct them, answer them as I do, and I appreciate this opportunity. But the fact is, doing nothing was not an option. And I would argue in those examples, by the way, Jeep's always been in peril, and they are significantly less than they used to be in Toledo. And NCR did leave Dayton, and there's a long legacy of, sure, we fought the good fight, but they're gone. So the question we had was, what can we make sure we have what we need? Which is healthcare that's aligned with the needs of the community, which are very different than they historically have been. And secondly, how can we make sure it stays around for decades to come? And we worked through all those issues and questions, and City Council affirmed the major assumptions of that healthcare conversation and voted to move us in a different direction. So my role was to basically be a spokesman for doing nothing is not an option for this community, that we need to be thoughtful. I have a very healthy respect for marketplaces. I come from a very competitive world of manufacturing, and I know marketplaces can be leveraged and they can be brutal, and that you can't really necessarily beat them, but you can, in fact, to align yourself to the best you can and end up better than you can by being very clever and creative and determined. The marketplace of healthcare is seismically changing. We are in a hyper-competitive local market, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. And our needs are profoundly different than they were decades ago. Our needs are driven by mental health issues. Our needs are driven by chronic care issues, often by lifestyle choices of alcohol, drugs, and obesity. And they show up in the form of heart health and type 2 diabetes and other joint disease-related issues, all of which you don't solve by lying in a bed. Now, there are going to be folks in Lakewood who will lie in a bed. In fact, less and less, though. My joke earlier about a healthcare executive was really no joke, because the fact of the matter is, if you're admitted to a hospital today, you're going to be there less frequently than you've ever been. You're not going to be there very long. Good for patients, bad for hospitals. So the economics have changed, and by confronting that and realizing the best strategy and trying to find the best partner, even though that ebbed and flowed, and we are in major disagreement between Save Lakewood Hospital about efforts to find that partner. And there's definitely different opinions of reality of what happened, why it happened, and what our options are in the future. And I will raise this question and answer it about this bid. There's a belief by some in this community, Kevin happens to be one, that if you go out to a public bid, magic happens. I have to tell you, that is sometimes the case for commodities, but not necessarily every case. There is a strategy that's often used exactly in these same circumstances called preemptory bids, where you understand the landscape that you need to move towards, you look at the partners who could deliver that future, and you ultimately ask them to give you their opinion of what that future is, and you affirm or deny the fundamental issues facing that marketplace, and you pick a partner and you begin to negotiate in the best manner and most aggressive fashion you know how to get the best deal to deliver goals that are clear. And that's what happened here. Now, Metro did show up briefly. There's clear difference of opinion of why Metro left, but they did withdraw. And they were given a second chance of whether or not they really were interested, and they withdrew again. St. Vincent's was never particularly interested. They had their own issues of doctors, availability, and health care. University Hospitals was the only one that raised the tortious interference. Tortious interference, by the way, is a concern over meddling with an existing contract. But even in the end, UH didn't feel that was an obstacle, nor did Metro, nor did St. Vincent's. We sought partners with 6 for-profit hospital systems that were interested and had shown demonstrated commitments in urban settings similar to ours across the nation, and they all declined to participate. And we did that in good faith. 1, we wanted to put pressure on the Cleveland Clinic, and 2, we wanted to determine whether there was an alternative out there. Ultimately, decisions were made in light of all of those factors that reflected a significant reinvestment. It preserved the assets of the trustees to be redeployed, $19.6 million to the city, roughly $23 million to the community, $24 million to the community. Those are not small dollars here, folks. And they will put us in a position to manage a neutral conversation about the future of healthcare. So if you call that nothing, then you're welcome to that opinion, Kevin. But I definitely took this as the most serious challenge to the future of Lakewood. And I used every tool and every experience I had to bring to bear the best outcome that I knew how. And whether it falls short of your expectations or probably 43% of the citizens who voted in the last election, I understand that equation, but it wasn't for lack of trying on my part. Now look, well, thank you, 57%. This has been a long night. I'll be happy to take questions from the floor out here, but I thank all of you for coming tonight. And Judy and Pam, if you have follow-up questions, I'll be here. Be happy to answer them. So thanks for coming tonight, folks. We got a great year ahead in Lakewood.